Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dwayne Brejak. I am the Executive Director for the Michigan chapter of NASW. I'm a macro licensed social worker. Michigan's one of those weird states that have a macro license. And we are so happy to have you all here with us today for our National Student Series events on social work and higher education, a career exploration. I know many of you are really fascinated and ready to hear from our speaker, Rachel Naasko, about various career opportunities that exist within the higher ed space. Some of you might be exploring that already or are in situations in higher ed. Our National Student Series happens every month. We've got one more left of 2023. We hope you'll join us for that program as well. That's going to be right before the holiday break, December 21st, and that's going to be a recap of all of the social work advocacy that's been going on over the last year. And as you know, in many of our states, it has been a real positive in some states and a real struggle in other states legislatively. So we want to talk about what it has looked like and felt like as a social work profession over the last year, as well as how we can build coalitions going into what will likely be and what we can all expect to be a really kind of gross election season next year. But for today, we're going to have a really awesome conversation about career trajectory and opportunities that exist within social work. I was in a meeting earlier today with what's called the Michigan Health Endowment Fund, which is kind of a big grant organization here in our state. And they were really surprised to hear of all of the places social workers work. And higher education is one of those places that a lot of folks don't think of when they think of social work, but we are an absolute fit for that. And I am so honored and happy to have Rachel here with us. Rachel, I will turn it over to you. Rachel is part of the Association of Social Workers in Higher Education, one of their initial co-founders of that organization. And I'd love to you get us kicked off for today.
Thank you, Dwayne. It's fun watching the chat. And so I told Dwayne, I'm like, you have to watch the chat for me because I don't want to get distracted. But welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to see that you are coming from near and far. We're going to go ahead and jump right in. I'm wondering, as you think about today or consider why you've joined, if you wouldn't mind adding in the chat what you might be hoping to get out of today, or if you have specific questions. We're certainly going to have lots of question time at the end and even maybe some time to talk to one another. And as I see you in the chat, I may even change up our slides or move more quickly through slides so that we can get to the things that you all really care about. So as Dwayne said, my name is Dr. Rachel Naasko, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a field faculty member at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. And I've been here for 7 years. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I found my way here and how I found my way into social work practice in higher ed. So why don't we go ahead and get started? My screen is yelling here. All right. We already did a little welcome. So again, the question I have for all of you is what interests you about a potential career in higher education as a social worker? So as I said, a little bit about me. I came to social work as a BSW student at Eastern Michigan University. And I knew right away that I wanted to be a school social worker. I was raised by two public school teachers, and I knew I didn't want, well, at that time I thought I didn't want to be a teacher, but I love the idea of working with kids in schools and improving educational outcomes. And so even as a BSW student, I was placed in Detroit Public Schools for my field placement, and then took a year off and got my MSW at Wayne State University, again focusing on, that's for those of you who are not familiar to Michigan, that's in Detroit. I fell in love with Detroit as a BSW student. I lived about 20 miles outside of Detroit, but loved my experience in my BSW program. And so I went to Wayne State and got my MSW and also did a field placement in schools. And that was a very challenging experience and very different than my experience in Detroit Public Schools. And then I went straight to practice and worked as a school social worker in therapeutic day school and in a public school for my first 3 years. And I found it very challenging, not for reasons maybe that you would think. I was feeling a little bit like my hands were tied, the role was somewhat narrow, and I wanted to do more. I could see how the systems were not necessarily working together. And I just felt really frustrated. And so it was at that time that I took a little break from social work and started my family. And while I was doing that, I was considering how I might come back to the field, knowing about my struggles in K through 12. And I had decided that I would do outpatient practice for a way to ease back in after staying at home and serving as a nanny. And I've learned very quickly that I did not want to be an outpatient therapist. It was felt slow to me, and I felt like I wasn't making the impact that I could make. And that was happening right around 2007. And there was also another major incident that happened in higher education in 2007. And many of you may not be old enough to remember this, but I am going to ask the question anyway. Does anybody know what happened in April of 2007 that was pretty significant to higher education? Any guesses? You can throw them in the chat if you have them. Waiting to see any ideas. Rebecca. Yes, Dwayne, that too. But Rebecca, you're right. It was Virginia Tech. And so
sorry, I couldn't get it to type out correctly. Virginia Tech.
You got it though. You got it. You're the only person that I've asked that question has gotten it right. So congratulations. So Virginia Tech happened. And what we know about Virginia Tech is that many professionals, faculty, staff, and students knew and understood the degree in which that student was struggling. And what happened was a systems failure. There was a lack of communication and a lack of coordinated effort about how to support students who are experiencing major mental health challenges. And so as a result, higher education had to quickly move into figuring out how they were going to do better. And so at that time, I was actually receiving clinical supervision, not because I didn't have my full license, but because I had never been an outpatient therapist before and really wanted extra support. And I was getting that support from the director of SAPAC at the University of Michigan, who happened to be a psychologist. And she got a promotion to the assistant dean of students at the University of Michigan to create a case management program to respond to emergent and urgent mental health needs on our campus here at Michigan. And she also got some money to hire some staff to support that program. And I had a client at that time who was in college, and I just really enjoyed working with her. And so Dr. Suit came to me and said, you know, I have this opportunity at Michigan. Would you be interested in coming? And originally it was for a 4-month appointment for 20 hours a week. Will you come and help us think about how we're going to provide case management services to avoid kind of the outcomes of Virginia Tech? And I was like, I had no idea what she was talking about, but I was enthusiastic. I was a long-time Michigan fan and family. My whole family went to Michigan. I did not. And so I did it. I just jumped in. And it really was a life changer for me. I will always say that that is where I fell in love with social work practice in higher ed. I was serving essentially as a case manager in the dean of students office. And when students were having mental health crisis, they would, when they were interacting with the social workers in those units at the hospital or other places on campus, they would be advised that if they were a social worker, or if they were a student, that the social worker could call the dean of students office and let us know that there was a problem or that they were having difficulties, and that we would support them. So if they were not hospitalized, we would reach out to them and follow up, and extend, academic notification, try to connect them to resources, get a better understanding of what was happening. But if they were hospitalized, then we would actually come and meet them at the hospital when they were on the unit to provide some assurance and reassurance, to let them know we wanted them to be there to take care of their health needs, and also to help them start to navigate what that might look like, either returning back to campus, or if the decision was made that they really wanted to return home and get care there, how did we help them successfully leave the campus so that they could return back if they wanted, or maybe even go to another institution. So my role then was really working very closely with their academic unit. Sometimes it was faculty, sometimes it was other resources on campus, a lot of financial aid, a lot of housing professionals. And I did that work for about 2 years. During that time, I got to know the university system very well. And that's one thing that social workers understand, is that we need to know the policies and we need to know the systems in which we work. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand that. And quickly, in 2010, I was offered the directorship of the Blaven Scholars Program that supported students who had experienced foster care, and now were returning or coming to Michigan to earn their bachelor's degree. And if you know anything about social workers, or the experience of foster care, you might know that only about 50% of children who enter the foster care system will earn a high school diploma, and even less. The numbers are ranging because things are changing, thankfully, to the interventions of many social workers. It used to say 2 to 4% would earn a college degree, and now they're upwards to somewhere between 3 to 11%, depending on the data that you're looking at, would earn a college degree. And so you can imagine there are all kinds of negative consequences when you don't have appropriate or full education to be able to achieve the things that you want to achieve. And we know that when we look at the outcomes of children who've experienced foster care, they're more likely to become parents at a young age. They're more likely to experience being unhoused. They're more likely to be incarcerated. And so there was really a passion here at Michigan to establish a support program for students who've experienced foster care. And I was asked to lead that program, really because of my experience in therapeutic day schools right after my MSW. Many of my students in that program were young sex offenders, and they were in foster care at that time. So I moved from, well, I didn't actually move. I continued to do critical incident management, is what they referred it to. And by the way, when I was doing that case management work, it really expanded beyond just mental health. We started to understand that all kinds of students were having major interruptions to their educational experience. And it wasn't always mental health. It was the things that happen to humans: fires, car accidents, loved ones passing away, catastrophic illness diagnosis. Many things were happening to students, and they really needed a support system to be able to navigate the many resources that we had, and also just the various players when you're having an interruption, again, like financial aid, housing, your faculty. So I served as kind of a coordinator of care for them as they were navigating these challenges and difficulties. And I was also leading the Blaven Scholars Program at the same time. I did that work for quite some time, and that was included being on call for our sexual, right here it's called SAPAC, so the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center. They have a 24-hour crisis line, and I was also responding to critical incidents that happened after hours for the entire campus. So responding to student deaths, or if there was an emergency on campus, or even if we had students who were studying abroad who were having emergencies there, I was responding and coordinating across the entire university, doing that work within the Dean of Students office. So There got to be a point where I was ready to not be on call anymore, and that moved me into field education. During the time when I was practicing in higher ed, I had probably about 20 different students from several different universities who were my field students. And so I was starting to see, not only in the Dean of Students office, but we were placing them in other units within student life, and starting to see how, while when I came to Michigan, I wasn't totally sure how I would navigate my professional identity as a social worker in that space where there were no other social workers. This was not new to me. It's what happened when I was a school social worker through K through 12. So I knew that there was going to be a time when I was going to have to kind of understand the culture and the context of this practice. But when I started to have students practicing in multiple units across the university, I really started to understand how translatable the skills that we have could be within this setting. So when I came to the field office, I was lucky enough to be assigned many of our field placements that are within higher education context, because that was an area of practice and expertise. And we started organizing a little bit here at the University of Michigan. MSWs were getting together and talking about the successes and challenges we were experiencing. And I'll talk a little bit more about what some of those looked like later on. And I also, now I was housed within a school of social work, and I started to talk to people about how we prepare students and what support students would actually need to be able to successfully navigate a career. Because as a graduate of 1999, we weren't talking about social work practice within higher education settings. It wasn't a conversation. And so often I tell students, I know you have an idea about what you want to do with your career, but I also want you to be open-minded, because we don't know what we're preparing you for in the future. And this is a perfect example of how social work, the foundation of social work education and the skills that you cultivate can be translated in lots of different arenas, even if they aren't presented to you in a formal way, like in your social work education experience. So I have served as the assistant director here. I provide LMSW supervision to people who work within higher education settings. Currently, I am supervising the director of clinical services at Madonna University, and I'm also providing supervision to law fellow who has her MSW and JD, and she teaches at the law school. And so I've done all kinds of different, I've worked with people who work in EAP programs here at the university as well. But it just kind of demonstrates how many places that social workers really can be found within the higher education context that we're going to talk about today. As Dwayne mentioned, I'm also the co-founder of the Association of Social Workers in Higher Education. And that is a brand new organization. We just got our 501c3 in 2022, and we're still kind of trying to catch the ground running while all of us have full-time jobs, and the board is all volunteers. So I'm hoping that that will grow soon. Thank you, Dwayne. I see that you put that in the chat. All right. So that's just a little bit about me and how I got here. When I was thinking about today, I knew I wanted to talk with you about the roles that you might find within higher education, and how to understand how social work competencies translate into the higher education context, and also understand the needs of social workers who are practicing within higher ed. I know I'm talking to newer professionals or students, and I always think you should have a heads up a little bit about the challenges that come along with the environment that you're in. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. All right, so many people, well, I didn't even know student affairs was a thing before I got to Michigan. I only lived in housing for 1 year. And in fact, I had a job at Eastern that was at the Women's Center, but I didn't think about it as student affairs, although it very much was. But we do have a lot of similarities to the ways that student affairs professionals are trained. And also there are some pretty significant differences. One being that they are not a licensed profession, and we are. But we also have professional values that guide our work. So do student affairs professionals. And we're working in interdisciplinary teams using interdisciplinary theories and methods that can be applied to any context, right? It's just that our limits are only in how we can translate what we understand and know to that new context setting. So this isn't any different than that. We also have these theories and methods that are uniquely aligned with the pressing challenges within higher education. And I'm going to ask you to think about your own higher education experiences and some of the challenges that you may have faced, where social workers may have been able to support you. So just think a little bit about either your undergraduate experience or your master's experience or any educational experiences, the challenges that you may have faced, and you can add these in the chat as well or keep them to yourself. But higher ed is just a system of people, right? And so we experience all kinds of things while we're here. And oftentimes we don't necessarily think that the higher education system is really here to support individual student needs, and yet it really is designed that way. So when you think about some of those challenges, whether they were financial aid challenges or housing challenges, or even accessibility challenges, those are all challenges that social workers could certainly address and are well prepared and suited to do so. And we'll see that even in the research that I show later on today. Okay. So it's a little bit of a grounding for all of us. I just want you to take a peek at some of the core values within social work. We value service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. We also have some theories that really support our work and that are highly relatable to higher ed. That includes, theories like human behavior and relationships, or as you'll see in my research that I'll show a little bit later, this person and environment theory comes up over and over and over again when you're working within the higher ed context, because it is then the environment that the student is in. As online programs have evolved, and I got my DSW at the University of Alabama and just graduated recently, that person and environment really changed for us, or even when COVID happened, right? Because the environment had shifted significantly. So social workers really have the ability to think about what is the environment that the student is in, and how do we adapt that to better meet the needs of the student. Community organizing and program development. Many of the resources that we see on college campuses are really it's programming that we're offering. If we think about our LGBTQIA resources, or even our counseling and psychological services and well-being offices, they often have programming that comes along with the services that they provide to individual students. So thinking about how does an institution respond more broadly to the needs and population of students, faculty, and staff. And then if we think about our methods, and we'll talk about the competencies later on, but we're always engaging, right? We're always assessing. We're intervening at all different levels of an organization, and then we're looking at our practice to see how effective was that. Is the student now meeting their educational goals, or do we need to go back again and find another way to try and support their interests? All of this is happening kind of behind the scenes, but also within that higher education context, just like other social work contexts, or more traditional, I should say. I want to take a quick minute to just think about, and since you're here, I'm guessing this has already dawned to you, but social workers have been advancing educational outcomes for a very long time. This is not new, although newer to higher ed. We were back in the 1900s, we were school social workers as visiting teachers, and we were really focused on attendance and the well-being of children. Then we kind of moved into higher ed in the 1950s, and the focus really was primarily mental health. We weren't thinking about all the unique populations and the needs, and also the changes that have occurred within higher ed since the 1950s. In 1978, the NASW developed the school social work standards. And so again, we started to codify what does our practice look like in education, and how do we align our values and ethical principles into these settings, and also articulate to others the value that we're bringing into these settings. In 2007, social workers moved beyond mental health. We started to respond to more emergent needs of students. So thinking about students who were unhoused, and thinking about students who were having difficulty having access to food and other resources. And again, that Virginia Tech piece, we really started thinking about more holistic and comprehensive care, and how does the university respond to the emergent needs of students. I was lucky enough, after Virginia Tech, one of the things that happened was they started a roundtable the very first year after Virginia Tech. And I remember knowing that about 8 schools attended. And then the second year, it was about 16 schools, and I was a participant in that roundtable. And at that time, we didn't have the formalization of the Higher Education Case Management Association. But eventually, in 2010, we hosted the roundtable here under my leadership and Amanda Burns. And we were getting to the place where we were formalizing that organization. So it's been around for quite some time now. And they're very well established, and they still have their annual conference and talk about all the needs kind of related to case management and the ways that case management shows up in higher education. And then again, in 2022, the Association of Social Workers in Higher Ed was formed, really to start to pay attention and make more visible the needs of social workers within this practice area. I am also want to share a little bit of the student affairs history, because universities weren't always thinking about the needs of students. They were thinking about the education that they were offering. And so I'm not going to read this whole quote to you, but I want to note that before the 1970s, student affairs consisted of some athletic programs and a few administrators who essentially acted as surrogate parents. And you'll hear this phrase in loco parentis, enforcing the rules and order. But in the late 1960s, institutions started to struggle to confront race relations, sexual violence, drug and alcohol abuse, and other controversial issues. And so they started to hire professionals to deal with those specific concerns. And then we saw a shift in the 1990s. That trend right then led to an explosion of student affairs offices and departments and educational programs. And basically there were people attending to the life of students all over college campuses. And so it really they've also, kind of shifted over time in the way that we think about students and what their needs are and what the college experience could and should look like. And so, I think it's important that we think about what is the relevance. And when I was working on my doctorate, which focused on social work practice in higher ed, my chairs kept asking me, like, why? Who cares? Why does this matter? And so I needed to get clearer about what the needs were. And so, as you see, our two leading organizations, NASW and CSWE, our accrediting bodies, I noted some gaps in implicit and explicit curriculum for students who wanted to pursue this as a pathway. There's also field placement opportunities, and as many of you may know, field placements are harder and harder to cultivate. And so it seems logical to me that we would turn to our own institutions to find those opportunities for practice, especially because our professional associations are saying that more professionals are seeking employment opportunities within higher education settings. And then also, and I'm going to talk about the professional socialization a little bit later, but we rely heavily on this idea in our profession that we will professionally socialize you to the social work profession. And they are directive about how we do that in schools of social work. And so as we think about your socialization to your career field, if we don't address it, or we don't offer it, or even name that there are social workers practicing here, it would be hard to also help you prepare for that professional socialization. And then when we think about NASW, they also are concerned about our professional socialization. It's one of their primary goals, is to keep us connected to the profession of social work. And so, and thank you to Dwayne for having insight and awareness and offering me this opportunity. Not everybody is in the same place. And so I still go places sometimes when people will say like, oh, I've never even thought about social workers practicing within higher ed. NASW also cares about our job satisfaction and wants to work towards improving the working environments that we're at. They are committed to helping us with our licensure supervision and also providing continuing education. And so both of our guiding professional associations have vested interest and should be bought into understanding even, and I wouldn't say just higher ed, but any emerging practice area for our profession. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the research says. And the reason I want to do that is because, first of all, anytime we're trying to establish an area of practice, it starts with the research. And I know sometimes students are like, oh, research. I don't want to talk about the research. We're not going to spend too much time. But I do want you to see how little research there is, even though we've been playing a role in higher education for quite some time, how few people are writing about it in any kind of significant way, and how that's contributing to our lack of visibility and support in the field of social work. So let's just take a peek. Oh, I saw this question. Will, what is CSWE's role in field placement opportunities? Well, their role is that they expect us in the field office to provide 25% of your curriculum. So 25% of your educational experience happens in field. And so I was pairing kind of this field placement opportunity within the social work education schools of social work, I should say, with kind of the goals that CSWE outlines for us as in our accreditation process, right? So we should be preparing students and offering them opportunities to practice in the fields that they hope to practice in. It's not a specific requirement, but that really is our thinking, right? We value to quite a big degree, 25%, right? The practice opportunity. And so I paired the field placement opportunity under CSWE because I think that it's part of your educational experience and the value of having that opportunity to practice in the context in which you're hoping to move to. It's not always possible, but there certainly, I think, is some value in recognizing that CSWE has pointed to field as the signature pedagogy of social work. All right. And Dwayne said he was going to be watching the chat for me and trying to help me keep those questions going, because I've seen some, but I want to make sure I get through what we want to talk about, and then we'll have a good discussion as we go. So let's see, what does it say? Well, let's see. Now, any good social work student would know you have to have a research question. So my research question was this: what does the literature say about the roles and practices of social workers and social work students in higher education settings? And I used what's called a systematic review. Some students have asked me, what's the difference between a systematic review and a literature review? And the easy way to think about it is when you're planning your systematic review, it's designed in a way that can be replicated by the reader or added onto. So in my research project, I've started the foundation. We're in the process of publishing the paper. For social work and higher ed, there isn't a systematic review yet published around this work. And then some other student might come along and either pick up where I left off, because you'll see the timeline in which my articles fall into, and I'm already getting a little bit beyond when that cutoff would be. Or they could actually repeat the same systematic review to see which articles I pulled and why or why not I included them. I talked to you a little bit about the importance of the professional socialization, and Sherry E. Miller really has kind of laid out a framework for us to think about what happens to social workers as they are moving through educational experiences and becoming a professional social worker. And so I just want to say, there are three primary stages. The pre-socialization is actually when you're just starting to think about, maybe I want to be a social worker, but you haven't even gotten to a program yet. That formal socialization happens when you're in a social work program. We give you content, we give you structure. And then when you graduate, you move into this practice after formal socialization. And that's when you're in that practice situation. And as you might be able to see, it's a little bit foggy, but it says situational adaptation. That's when you're translating those social work competencies into the context in which you're practicing, right? And most people are doing that with some kind of support from other social workers, possibly a supervisor. But in this context, oftentimes you're the only social worker that may be in your environment. And so that's one of the areas that I have particular wonderings about, right? What happens to our socialization after you leave your NSW program? And so we have to talk about our methodology very quickly. I use the PRISMA model, and it really is the gold standard for systematic reviews. And so I just followed the manual exactly for that. My criteria were pretty simple, actually. They had to be available in English so that I could read them. They had to address a specific role that a social worker holds in higher education, or they had to highlight or discuss social work field placements in higher education. So when I was doing my searches in databases, when I put in social work in higher ed, almost always it came back to social work education. And so any of those articles were not included in the review. This was really about the practice of social workers in these settings outside of schools of education. And here is the data. So I found about 641 articles that came up in my searches. And I reviewed, if you look at the full text review, I reviewed about 49 articles, and I ended up only including 28. And based on the criteria that I had showed you earlier. And so that's what you're going to see. These following slides are really just, what did I learn in those 28 articles? So the articles were written from 1971, and if you might remember back to our the little history lesson we had earlier, this was a pivotal moment too, all the way up to 2022. And we talked about what perspective were they giving, what journals they came from. They came from a myriad of different kinds of journals. I think we had 5 different countries represented in that 28 articles. And we also had different kinds of articles. So sometimes you're looking at a systematic review for only qualitative or quantitative data. And I included everything. So I had other students' master's thesis included. I had what they called gray literature. So non-peer reviewed literature that came from places like NASW and the Social Work Today magazine, online magazine. And ultimately I came up with some different themes that came up over and over and over again. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today. So here were the themes. One was just, what is the role of social workers in higher education? Many talked about that specifically. And it moved beyond just mental health. And that's often where people think about social workers in higher ed. There were articles that talked about field education specifically, talking about students who were in their field placements, working on interdisciplinary teams, and the differences between training, let's say, counseling students versus master's level social workers. There were students that were placed in food pantries and also in programs that supported students who experienced foster care. There were plenty of articles, I think 5 were just focused on mental health. And they really talked about college counseling centers and how they were supporting the mental health needs of students from, again, very different perspectives. Substance use was a huge theme as well, especially with the emergence of collegiate recovery programs. There were articles, articles that spoke specifically about the advocacy role of social workers within collegiate recovery. And that kind of reminded me of how we often are trying to illuminate the unique needs of specific populations in any community or organization. And so that kind of rang true here in our research. And then again, with foster care, same thing. It's an emergent population that higher ed campuses were expected to be responding to. And of course, as you know, social workers are often right in that work. As new needs emerge, we are often asked to figure out ways to respond to them. And foster care was not any different. And then this probably isn't a surprise to anyone either, but diversity, equity, and inclusion also was a reoccurring theme in some of the articles, and talking about how do we make our campuses more inclusive, and even when we do, how are we supporting students? So you can bring students together with diverse needs, but if we're not prepared to understand what that looks like in our teaching and on our campuses, we really are doing a disservice to students. So they talk a lot about how do we create diverse campuses, how do we create equity, and how do we create a sense of belonging and inclusion for students. They used a little bit of the data. One of the things I wanted to highlight was that 50% of the articles talked about the need for social workers to have specific coursework to practice in higher education. And I'll talk a little bit, I'm going to show you a little bit of kind of what that content could look like. And then almost half also talked about the need for more research and how social workers are practicing within this area. We have very little data about how many social workers are practicing in higher ed across our country, and in what capacity. There were no studies that I found that really articulated that specifically, even through NASW or CSWE. We just don't have the data yet. The other thing I'd like to mention is this, I think I said it earlier, that person and environment approach. A lot of the articles talked about that goodness of fit in our education and training. And I wanted to highlight that for all of you, because I want you to start to see how your social work education, and regardless of where your field placement is, really helps to prepare you to work in this specific environment because of that lens that we use for person and environment. Let's see. Something special here. Oh yeah, access and retention. That's something I haven't really mentioned yet. There are many social workers who are working in outreach, so K through 12 settings, to promote educational access and to support students in kind of pre-college programs. Here at Michigan, we have something called the Wolverine Pathways, and they're in it while they're starting in middle school through high school, and it really is a coaching program that helps students stay engaged in their academics, and then support through the application process for institutions, the decision-making process, and also the financial aid application process. So social workers doing that work all along the way too. This wasn't a surprise, but I wanted to highlight that this was the area where other countries were writing articles about the way that social workers are supporting students around mental health needs specifically, and this was more an international or global perspective. I think I already said in substance use, we talked a little bit about the key to advocacy, and I think I see that with other populations, specifically with foster care as well. They talked a lot about campus-based programs and also pre-college programs that we're offering to help support that transition to college. And again, you'll see that highlight of the person environment perspective in both of the articles that we're noting diversity and inclusion, and also the alignment of our values. That social justice focus is a great fit for social workers in higher ed. There are some limits to this research. I was the only researcher because it was my dissertation project, and so I really couldn't have other people working with me in it, but I was using consultation as needed. I had a very broad inclusion criteria, and some might argue too broad. I underutilized the librarian services, so if I had had more time, librarians are often awesome resources for people who are doing systematic reviews, and I just didn't have that much time. And again, I limited my articles to only those in English. So what does this mean? What are the implications of the research? Well, knowing that the Code of Ethics calls us to create knowledge development, we are also called to advance the profession, and we're also called to train the next generation of social workers. When I think about my experiences in higher ed and how I can help prepare all of you or the future generations of social workers, those three things, you know, creating knowledge, starting with the systematic review, and helping the profession understand and see those of us who practice here so that they can be better attuned to the needs that we have. There are lots of environmental changes that are happening even within higher education settings, and social justice issues are booming everywhere, and social workers are uniquely prepared to think about those and provide interventions for those. But we have to be able to articulate how we understand that as we approach these roles. We certainly have a need for more research, more descriptive data, intervention studies, and a closer look at the professional socialization and identity development. When I was working in the Dean of Students office, I would often come across people who had BSWs or MSWs, but they would not identify as social workers. They would identify as student affairs professionals. And I would ask why. I was proud of my social work identity, and I did catch resistance. My supervisor in the Dean of Students office told me I was not a social worker in this role, but I was a student affairs professional who had a social work background. And it was a source of tension. I disagreed with her, but it impacted my experience as a social worker because they were unwilling to provide professional development money so that I could maintain my license. So I had to pay for that on my own and take vacation time, as opposed to my student affairs professional friends who would get funding for student affairs conferences, and that would be counted as part of their work time. So that's a simple example of like how working in a setting where there aren't a lot of social workers, or there's a misunderstanding about what social workers do or can do, or how they're seen in our profession, can impact somebody in a new practice context. And then, of course, having a professional community to lean on for support. You know, where are the other people who are doing this work? I didn't see this so much in college counseling centers because oftentimes there are other social workers there, unless you are a social worker of one, like my LMSW or LMSW. But we really need a space to be able to talk and learn and grow with others who are in these same kinds of environments, even when our role is slightly different. So I think I've talked a little bit about this, but I just want to kind of get your brain thinking about where social workers might show up. So we really are present at all, or could be present at all levels of the organization. And we're not always just serving students, although that has been my primary focus. But there are many ways in which social workers also serve faculty and staff. And again, that could be in employment assistance programs. It can be within research settings, even in leadership roles. Even outside of schools of social work. I know that there is a social worker, and I'm blanking on her name right now, who is the president of the university that she works at. And so that is a major leadership organization that she is leading and having to think about all the constituents that are at play. We've talked about counseling services. We've talked about health and wellness services. Here at Michigan, we have a university health services, and then we have a whole wellness coaching division. And many of those, not all, but many of those folks are all social work trained or public health trained. We're also program managers and we are directors, right? We lead at all levels of the organization, but we can think about how to bring communities together and offer effective programming and then evaluate its effectiveness. We're in those outreach and recruitment settings. Sometimes it's even in admissions. So I talked a little bit about early pre-college programs, but we also are in admissions offices looking at applications and trying to determine which students are a good fit for our organization. Lots of academic advisors around. These are also people who often don't identify as social workers. They identify as an academic advisor, but are often trained as social workers. Program evaluators. I talked a little bit about residence life or housing. Any kind of student support services. So I'm thinking about judicial offices. Sometimes that happens in the Dean of Students office. Sometimes there's a separate office. Sexual misconduct is a huge, huge role. And I was surprised actually to not find any articles around our work that we're doing in that particular area. I mentioned leadership, and last but not least, athletics. There's a whole profession of social workers in sports, but we have a lot of students who are interested in working at the collegiate level specifically. And sometimes it's students who were collegiate athletes themselves that would like to give back. And so they might be working in the counseling department or academic support department, or all the way up into coaching and performance roles. There are some terms that I thought I would just try to get you start thinking about, because again, that orientation to the context in which you're going to practice, I think is really important. So even understanding when we say higher education, what do we actually mean? We're talking about those 2- and 4-year institutions of higher learning. And I would also just think about the differences in kinds of institutions. So what does it look like to be at a community college versus what does it look like to be at an institution that provides primarily online education versus at a Big 10 school or even a small private school, right? So the context can shift and change, and the way that you might practice may need to be responsive to the organizational context or values within it. Student affairs is generally an area within colleges and universities concerned with the development of students outside of the classroom. So usually when I'm teaching this, I'll just say, think about all the things that you did when you were not in the classroom. That is all the things that are related to student affairs. Even your dining, right? I supervised somebody who was an assistant director of dining, getting her LMSW, and she was in charge of all the student workers. And at Michigan, we see every opportunity as a learning opportunity. So she was constantly having to coach them in the work that they were doing and their professional growth and identity in that environment. Student development. So it's a conceptual and theoretical foundation used to understand and work with college students. So there's a whole, and I think I show this next. There is something called student development theory, and it's human development theory is focused on how individuals who are enrolled in college develop, incorporates physical, biological, physiological, psychological, social, and environmental factors. And what does that sound like? It sounds like social work, but they're really just thinking about what's happening within the college context. And I think that that's also really getting pushed on a little bit, because oftentimes we think about what the undergraduate experience might look like, but when we think about graduate students, both at the master's level and PhD level, or other doctoral level education, the needs are quite different, right? And so we have to think about, again, what's the context of the student and where are they developmentally in terms of their needs. Sometimes when I'm talking to graduate students, because that's primarily who I serve in my role, we're talking about the demands that are happening within their family and how challenging it is to balance classes and work and parenting, or other caregiving needs. And so that's very different than talking to a 17-year-old who is adjusting, coming to college and really missing home and their network of support from the community that they came with. So we're really thinking about the needs across the lifespan for students. There are some specific schools of thought around student development theory. We're not going to go down too far, but psychosocial, cognitive, and moral development theories, typology, and person and environment theories. Again, there you see that same language coming from social work, even in a whole different area of practice or career development. Okay. So remember, I told you we were going to see these competencies coming out again, and I summarized them. These are the ways that I talk about them with my students, but I wanted to just get you thinking and chewing on this a little bit, and we're almost done with our slides, and then we're just going to answer some questions, and if we have time, we can even get into some small groups. But when you're thinking about things like, let's just say social policy, when we train students, we want them to take those competencies and apply them to this new context, right? So the social policies that are important in higher education might include things like FERPA, right? So in medical settings or in mental health settings, we're often talking about HIPAA, and that's true for college counseling centers and health and wellness centers too. But when we are working in student affairs offices, we're thinking about FERPA, and that's a federal law that protects your educational privacy. And so social workers would need to understand how FERPA applies to the work that they're doing. I'm also thinking about things like Title IX or the Clery Reporting Act, all policies that require higher education settings to follow or report back to other authorities. So understanding what policies impact your practice within higher education settings would also be essential as you prepare to consider this work. You know, I think I highlighted this a little bit, but what engagement might look like if you're working with undergraduate students who have just left home versus what you might be thinking about in terms of engaging an adult learner or somebody who has caregiving responsibilities or even a disability status, right? So just like we do in other areas of social work, we need to understand the person in front of us and then be able to adjust the way that we might engage and reach them. When I was the director of Laven Scholars, the students often didn't email, they wanted to text me, right? And so I needed to be able to kind of meet them where they were at and use the technology that they were using so that I could build rapport, because they were very hesitant to build rapport with yet another social worker. Assessment looks different in all of those roles that I already shared with you. Sometimes I think social workers can think very narrowly about, okay, I'm doing a biopsychosocial assessment, right? But we're always assessing what are the needs of the person in front of us or the communities that we're serving. If we're thinking about a specific racial group on campus, what are their specific needs and how do we connect with them to better understand that? And then what do our interventions look like in higher education? The easy one, right? If you think about college counseling centers, you're doing that 50-minute session. But if you are the hall director, what does intervention look like with your residents who might be having a roommate conflict, and how do you think about the interventions that you might use, or even how you might engage? And then more specifically, even evaluation. How often do we get to think about the effectiveness of our practice? And this is also one of the big gaps I saw in my research, is we just aren't doing a lot of research on how effective is that case management that we're doing, you know, for Dean of Students offices. It felt effective. I'll tell you that I had students graduating, but there's no real study that talks about the effectiveness of case management strategies within higher education settings. So there's definitely a need for us, not only social workers, but I would say student affairs professionals, to start to collect data about the effectiveness of our practices. So what challenges do we face? Well, we've got a couple. One, we have some visibility issues. Well, I see there are 73 people here today, and that is totally amazing. Many students have never considered a career in higher ed because we don't always talk about it, and they don't necessarily see social workers practicing in what I would call non-traditional roles. And as I mentioned before, social worker, people who have been trained in social work may not even identify as social workers because of their professional socialization or lack thereof. We also have some challenges around getting schools of social work to pay attention to what are the specific educational needs around those who want to practice in this area. Again, I've highlighted some of the policies or theories that might be critical for students to really understand when placed in those. And so instead of placing that responsibility on the field instructors at those sites, how can social work education programs integrate that opportunity for students? Just like we do for school social workers here in the state of Michigan, here we require 3 courses plus 500 hours of direct work with children and families. So is there a way for us to think more about how we can use schools of social work to better prepare those who want to enter this area of practice? We also have a challenge around licensure support and supervision. So in the state of Michigan, you can't call yourself a social worker unless you have a license. And the challenge here is that people have to make the choice to get licensed, right? And so if your job doesn't require a license, it may have little motivation for you to actually go through whatever that process is, the exam and the supervision hours. And even if you were motivated, you may not be able to find a licensed social worker to provide those supervision hours, or it might be cost prohibitive to do so. Or maybe even time offered away from your job to receive that supervision. So I can see easily a gap, even in my own practice here at Michigan, where there just isn't structural support for licensure. And what does that mean in terms of our practice and also our professional socialization? There's a lack of continuing education. So anytime I get asked to do this kind of thing, I always jump at the chance. But the reality is that there are very few specific opportunities. In fact, I've never attended one that I was hosting that is an event related specifically to social work practice within higher ed. I will say that there's another emerging group or now formalized group of collegiate counseling center social workers. And so they started to come together to try to meet their own specific needs. But again, that continuing education piece that feels directly relevant, that gets us the CEs that we need to maintain our license, I think is the challenge then. And then again, financial support to do that. And then, support for the development of our social work professional identity in an interprofessional setting. So back to my example of my supervisor telling me I'm not a social worker in a higher education setting, but I'm a student affairs professional with a social work education. That was a moment for me where I really had to reevaluate how I was going to talk about my identity as a social worker. And it wasn't because this person was trying to be harmful. They really were undereducated about our profession and what we offer. And some of that I think was on me and my lack of educating them about how social work practices, because the view at that time was that I wasn't in the counseling center, and so my license wasn't required, and so I wasn't a social worker, which is very odd because they established my salary at that time based on the counseling center social worker. So I don't know. That was a weird situation, and we were back in 2008. I hope that we are better now than we were at that time. I will also say that I think student affairs leaders and organizations recognize now that the value of social workers. So NASW is a major professional organization for student affairs professionals. And they have been talking about the value of social work for a few years now, and actually offer CEs at their conferences. They were not doing that when I was in the Dean of Students office between 2008 2016. So that's kind of a new or emerging development. And so in response to these challenges, we've developed the Association of Social Workers in Higher Education. We're a nonprofit organization that supports and connects professionals and students to advance and formalize and enhance the visibility of the profession within higher education settings. And our goal is really to, we're working on developing a membership model. Right now, you can just join us, and I encourage you to do so. There'll be a slide coming up that will give you that information. We offer professional development and resources, licensing support, and opportunities for social workers to practice higher education, to connect, and more. And like I said, we're in the very baby infancy stage. So if you're excited about this work and would love to join us, we would love to have you. So please consider checking in with us. So before we do our breakout sessions here, I'm going to check in and just see how the questions are going. So are there people or questions that you think I should start with, Dwayne, or do people want to raise their hand and ask questions? Where are we here?
Oh, this was fabulous. You've answered quite a few of the questions that have come through as you've went through the slides.
Okay.
One of the questions that kind of expands a little bit more that you talked about a little bit is, do you see your association and what role do they have in interacting and partnering with other higher ed groups, including NABITA and NASPA?
Yeah, okay, so NABITA and NASPA, both of those. So I have, let's see, so this is a great question. So right before COVID hit, I was on the conference delivery track and had proposals accepted at NASPA, NASW, the National Conference, and CSWE. And then COVID happened. And so then I didn't do any of that. And then I started my DSW, and there was no space for anything extra at that time. So I think, and we've been talking about this, like, at one point, the leadership of ASWHE was saying, like, do we really need an organization, right? Should we be should we be advocating with NASW or other organizations like NASPA to come up with like a knowledge community or something like that? And to be honest, we thought it would be easier for us to just start our own. We learned a couple lessons. It's not easy to run a nonprofit professional organization without any support. And so I think that really has slowed us down. And I also think that that's kind of where we're moving to, is leveraging relationships with other organizations. NABITA has a very specific focus. And so I would be open to collaboration with them at any time. They were kind of front and center when HECMA, the Higher Ed Case Managers Association, was kind of coming to bloom. And I was in the leadership at that point with that organization. And NABITA really wanted us to come over at that time. And we decided to have our own organization. So I don't really know what has happened between those two organizations or how much collaboration exists there. But I think that that's something that we certainly are going to need to do with ASWHE, because we are all volunteers and we need the structural support of some of these major organizations, just like we're doing today, right? I would never have gotten to talk to all of you if Dwayne and NASW Michigan didn't offer the opportunity. So for that, I'm very grateful. Oh, you're muted, Dwayne.
Think we know about mute by now. No, we're just so grateful that you're doing this work. And I think that there are other avenues, even within social work, that have similar sorts. I mean, when I think about sport social work, and there's a couple of comments about that, you know, that's even a subset, that there's a fairly significant group of social workers that are in that, and folks in fairly high positions. I mean, the athletic director at the University of Michigan is an MSW, right? That's a big, I mean, a lot of stuff going on with that right now, but that's a very
That's a
interesting
different
to have a
topic.
social work degree, right? Yeah. A couple of questions that came through specifically around how do you see, or where do you see social workers who may want to intersect their work with higher ed, but have a different sort of job as maybe their primary, maybe they're a clinician or a private practitioner, but want to do some work in a higher ed setting? Are there spaces that seem more appropriate for that?
Oh, that's a good question. So, all right. So here's my real thought. I think anybody who wants to work in higher ed can certainly make the transition. And I say this to my social work students all the time. It's about your ability to translate the skills that you have learned either in your program or in your professional career and make connections to those to that role that you're trying to get into. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to just start looking at those job descriptions and thinking about, okay, what have I done that is similar? Because your job will be to translate, right, for them how to go about that. And that's one of the things I think that ASWHE could help more with, right, is like that practice of, so if I've done group work, what does that look like in student affairs outside of a counseling center? And there are lots of ways that we do kind of group facilitation, especially in programmatic elements. It helps to have connections directly within higher education to be able to have some of those conversations, but also, we know that it's all about the networking, right? And especially at large places like Michigan, I guess my other thought would be to try to break into a smaller organization first and get some experience. And then if you really are interested, then and want to move into kind of a larger institution, that would be the next step. My LMSW, who's at Madonna University, she's had several roles there. She graduated in 2020 and has been promoted several times. And so now she can kind of talk about, it has some experiences to be able to talk about what that might look like. And she's applying for jobs at like Big 10 universities because that's what she would like to do. So I think that it's possible. I think the goal, and also I would say, look at your own universities that you came from, if you're local to them. They often want to bring back their alumni. This is something I didn't know, but it's true. They love to bring their alumni back. So that might be one way to start to think about like what kinds of settings. There are two places that I usually point people to in terms of job search. So other than just going to every university's individual site, there is a higher ed recruitment consortium website that is a national website, but you can also search it down to state and region. And I think that's like a collaboration from, or it shows all the jobs from multiple universities. So it's a little bit of a time saver. And then there's also higheredjobs.com. Some people prefer that one. I usually prefer the consortium website specifically. Good question.
That's a great resource. A few questions around folks who are interested in adjunct. I know that wasn't the focus of today, but I think that kind of fits right with what you just said. Sometimes it's connecting with the school and finding who that key faculty who's usually hiring, and maybe even attending continuing education program or networking events at that particular school, especially if it's not your alumni base.
Yes. So the teaching part is a different beast. So I would say look at your program coordinators. Usually there's a BSW, MSW program coordinator, and usually they can help point you to teaching opportunities. You will also find those at those higher ed jobs as well. Don't forget about the online programs. If you are enthusiastic about teaching, sometimes getting into online programs is a little bit easier in terms of first steps to teaching. And you can be anywhere, so that's kind of great. But I would go back to your original institutions and start there as an alumni. And if you're not already, if you're not taking students for field placements, that is another huge way in. And I didn't even know that. Like I was so clueless. I was just like, I love social work. I love students. We're going to do the things. But that was really what got me into, because I had so many field students. That's what really got me into being a qualified candidate for the role that I'm currently in within the field office. And so I'm teaching, but I'm also serving as a liaison to students in field, and I'm also doing the placing process. So being a field instructor, connecting with program directors, making sure any training, if you have been a trainer or any places where you have done teaching, you must highlight that on your resume. If you've had no teaching experience, it might be hard to get in. So think about when you have facilitated, when you have trained, or even start to try to take some CE courses that are around social work education. I love that idea, to get connected to continuing education groups and build relationships there. That was a great idea.
Wonderful. Folks are wondering, how do they sign up for your mailing list? It doesn't appear to be listed on the website. So is there a direct link where folks can do that?
Contact us. Let's do this. There should be. Hold on one second.
While you're sharing that, I'll just talk about just briefly about all of those careers. I mean, right, Dr. Naasko talked about a lot of different career options in higher ed, and there are more than are not even on the list. When you mentioned libraries, that's a place that social workers work. And thinking about, especially if there are folks on who have dual degrees, where are there places that can utilize maybe your dual degree in public health, in public policy, in campus safety? There are social workers in such non-traditional places, and it really is a plethora of job opportunities. And I think when folks are thinking about career options, looking beyond, like you said, it may not be titled social work, but your skills are going to be absolutely relevant to any of the positions you might be applying for.
Yeah, don't look for social work. They sometimes will say, like, looking for student affairs professionals or other related fields. That's us. We're the other related fields. So yeah, don't look for social work jobs, because often, especially at big institutions, it's going to draw you to either counseling centers, or it's going to draw you to the health centers that are attached to, like Michigan Medicine, for instance, right? University of Michigan is the big mother lode ship. But if you type social work into our career finder, it's going to come up with medical social work jobs. So you'll have to look for, usually under student services or administration is usually what you're looking for if you're going to a specific university's website.
Yeah, great. And if folks, we probably have time for one or two more questions, so please feel free to drop those into the chat. But one question I have is, if you're going to advise our social work students to look at additional skill or take an additional course during their program that would help towards a job in a higher ed setting, what might be the thing that you would recommend?
This is a good question. So I always challenge us all to deepen our knowledge and understanding about working with people who hold different identities than we do. Because it is, there's a huge emphasis in higher ed right now and an expectation, not just from hiring committees and leadership, but also students. They expect that you're going to be able to understand kind of the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're going to have ideas about how you handle those conversations, both in a classroom, but also in your individual work with students. And so I think, making sure that you feel pretty confident about how you would talk about working across difference in practice, how you've deepened your knowledge, especially for us white folks. How have you deepened your knowledge and practice? What exploration have you done? And what evidence do you have that you've actually done that, right? And it can look like all different kinds of things. You know, I started focusing on creating a more inclusive field experience for students, and that kind of brought me down into all different kinds of areas. I know the University of Michigan School of Social Work has a dismantling oppression certificate. That's a CE certificate. So having and being able to demonstrate that even on your resume and in your cover letters about how you are adequately prepared to work across difference, I think that is really, 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 really important.
Shelby added a really good resource from Colorado State, free course that explores student affairs and higher ed positions. So thank you for sharing that, Shelby.
Yes, I didn't know that existed. So I used to only know, thank you. I'm going to copy this. Thank you. The Stony Brook School in New York at one point, and I think they're still doing it, had a more macro social work and higher ed track. And it was a couple courses that they had built together. And that was really the only one that I've seen across the country outside of my mini course that I did back in 2019 that I have yet to replicate. That's going to be resurrected, I think, as a continuing education opportunity. And maybe I could pass that along to you, Dwayne, so that others can also be aware. But thank you for sharing that, because that's the first one I've seen. So I'm excited to reach out to them and take a look at what they're doing there. Ohio State is also their field office. We did a presentation at CSWE about the work that we've been doing at Michigan around social workers in higher ed, and also at Ohio State. And it was super fun to collaborate with them. And they're also trying to move the needle. They had a seminar around social workers in higher ed practice there too. Their assistant director, Anne, is awesome. And she's getting her PhD right now, I think, in higher ed.
Well, it's so amazing to see some focus on this and hopefully some continued momentum. We need more social workers in these sorts of roles. And I think we're seeing, especially post-COVID, the need for mental health supports to be increased across all of our campuses. And that intersects in all of these different sectors within our institutions. And that also goes up into management levels in higher ed too. And that is all across all of our schools. I don't see any other questions that are in. So I want to thank you so much for your time today, Rachel. This was so good. I learned a lot. It's always really fascinating to see how social work continues to grow and the places our degrees can take us. And so I hope folks feel more optimistic about the potential roles you can go into after your degree. For the folks who are already in institutions of higher ed, I hope this helped you connect to some other folks across the country. And we are going to continue our programs every month through NASW for our student series. So be on the lookout for those every third Thursday of the month from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. So again, just thank you all for being here from all across the country, and have a great holidays if we don't see you the rest of this year.
Thanks, Dwayne. I put my email in case people can't. I think there's an ASWHE@gmail email. And it should be on our website, but if not, you can email me directly and I'll pass it along to our social work student. She can reach out to you. She's just about to graduate, but I'm sure she'd be excited to hear from any of you. So please reach out. I'd be happy to talk with you more. And thanks for spending your Thursday night with me. And thank you, Dwayne, for inviting me. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.